Good afternoon. I'm Robert McDermott, and I'm about to speak on the Hebrew Scriptures. The Christians refer to the Hebrew Scriptures as the Old Testament, but that's not altogether fair. It gives the impression that somehow it's past. Well, it's old, but it's not past. It's a continuing revelation. At least the words don't change, but the meanings change with each new generation of interpreters. So it's the ancient contemporary Hebrew Scriptures. Now, in a previous class, we talked about 4 chapters in a book by Karl Jaspers, Socrates, Confucius, Jesus, and Buddha, or Buddha and Jesus, I guess. And so you got some idea, if you read those chapters, that these 4 are fabulously different. And Jaspers tries to say what they have in common, but it's kind of hard, except to say that they're exceptional. They're amazing. They're in some sense unique, and had spectacular influence, but really different. Now, one of the differences that we're going to encounter today is the difference between the Hebrew Scriptures and the particularly the Chinese tradition, or Confucius and Lao Tzu. And one of the differences, to start right in, is revelation. This book that I'm looking at, the book of Genesis, I'm using the Hebrew Bible. It's very thick and probably too heavy to carry around, but it's wonderful to have at home because it has large print. And it's upside down, but you get the idea. It's very readable and large subtitles, and you know what you're doing. It's wonderful. Whereas most Bibles are actually kind of frustrating because they have double column and tiny print, and you can't mark anything, etc. And I suspect that many people stop reading because it's just physically challenging. But the Hebrew Bible is wonderfully clear and wonderful translation by many great scholars, and it's a great physical production. So I'm right now looking at Genesis, part 1, the origin of the world and of humankind. It actually says mankind because they didn't know that what we know about the importance of gender-inclusive language. And then it talks about the creation and the fall. So if any of you know anything, whoever I'm speaking to, if you know anything at all about Western religion, called the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, 3 major religions that make up more than half of the world, you'll think about God, the Creator, creating the heavens and the earth and the sun and the moon, etc. And you could, if you haven't read it, you could easily imagine that this account goes on for long chapters, maybe, it could go on for volumes, and of course there have been hundreds, thousands of volumes written about the creation story. In fact, however, the point I'm trying to make is that the creation story is about a page and a half. So I have it marked right here, each day of creation. It took 7 days, as you know. We have 6 days, and then on the 7th day, Sunday, God rested, and we don't seem to be good at resting anymore, but on the 7th day, but that is definitely the idea, to rest and observe the Sabbath. The Jews observe Saturday, and the Christians observe Sunday, but it's the idea in both cases, to be conscious that God's work, first of all, that it is God's work, and that it had a beginning and an end, and that when it was over, God said it was good. That's one of the points I'm eager to make, is that in the Jewish tradition, the world is good. There may be terrible suffering. There may be all kinds of things going wrong, and the Jewish people themselves are not always faithful to God's law and God's will, but overall, the world is good. The famous line from Anne Frank, I still think that people are good, and the Jewish tradition says we still think the world is good. Why? Because it was created by God, and God is good. So the book of Genesis begins with an account of creation, and the first day God created light. Well, of course, If you have light, then you have to have the sun and the moon, but God doesn't create the sun and the moon until the fourth day. So clearly this is not a scientific or even a historical account. It's a mythological account. Now in the little book by Jaspers, Socrates, Confucius, and Buddha, we read a little bit and we discussed a little bit about the transition from mythos to logos, or from myth to knowledge, which comes about, and I think there's reason to agree with Jaspers about this, it comes about very significantly in around the 5th to 6th century BCE, that is to say before the Common Era. It used to be called BC, before Christ. That's when people in the West who were dating were sure that everybody would agree that the coming of Christ is the beginning of a new history. But not everybody agrees with that, so they changed the word by consensus. No war, it was just an agreement that we would use the word common instead of Christian. Okay, so this Genesis that tells this creation story so briefly is not doing history, though some people have insisted that it's historically, scientifically accurate, or at least it's historically accurate, and to the extent that it's not, that it doesn't conform to science, well then science must be mistaken. But this is sort of regrettable, because it sort of flies in the face of several centuries of very respectable science. So the world is not several thousand years old, it's 15 or 14 billion years old, and we have all kinds of evidence about that. So this a sort of literal interpretation of the Bible is pretty much a temptation of the past. And if you study this in college, there's no chance of your being told that it's literally true. No, it's mythos. It's a story which gives us an appreciation rather than literal knowledge. It gives us a picture. It gives us an insight into the power of the divine, the creativity, the goodness, and the way in which the divine is the source of everything, the source of all the galaxies, and then getting closer to our world, to the sun, the moon, the earth, and all of matter, and all of spirit evolving. So this creation begins, in the beginning God created the heaven and earth. Now the earth was a formless void. There was darkness over the deep, and God's Spirit hovered over the water. Beautifully poetic, right? And it's not, clearly we're not doing facts. We're doing pictures, we're doing appreciation. Then the dry land appeared, and on the third day the sun and the moon, and on the fifth day the living creatures, and on the sixth day, I'll read this for you, that the earth reproduced every kind of living creature, cattle, reptiles, every kind of beast. And so it was. God made every kind of wild beast, every kind of cattle, and every kind of land reptile. God saw that it was good. God said, let us, that's an interesting word there, let us make man, human beings, in our own image. That's a very important phrase. In our own image. In the likeness of ourselves, again plural. And let them be masters of the fish of the sea, the birds of the heaven, the cattle, all the wild beasts, and all the reptiles that crawl upon the earth. God created man in the image of himself. Now it switches to singular. In the image of God he created him, male and female, and he created them, male and female. God blessed them, saying to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and conquer it. There are several tough terms in here from the point of view of our ecological sensibility and ecological necessity. Control and dominate, and dominate doesn't come yet, but it will come, and be masters. And then it says, and so it was. God saw all he had made, and indeed it was very good. Evening came and morning came, and the sixth day. Then the seventh day, God rested, as we should do. Now there's a problem in here, in that the human is given special status as somehow the dominant force in the earth. And that may have been okay, maybe not, but at least it was possibly okay in ancient times, and maybe even up until modern times. But in a world which we human beings have made disenchanted and have made the earth into an object and for exploitation and extraction, then it's no longer okay to think about the human using the earth and controlling it and dominating it. So this is a tremendously important controversy, and lots has been written about whether Judaism and the Abrahamic religions, but particularly the book of Genesis, is responsible in any significant way for the ecological crisis that we are in. So the Genesis is a book, even if you only read the first 3 pages, but even if you continue reading, you'll find that it has a particular slant or a perspective. And the perspective is the perspective of the writers sometime in the, say, 8th, 7th, 6th century. These texts evolved slowly with many authors. These texts are written from the point of view of the authors, trying to attribute to God as the source of the present situation. So what is the present situation like for those authors? Well, it was very hard. They were a tiny little nomad group of shepherds, really, and they had no material power, they had no imperial power, they didn't even have political stability. They basically were inconsequential and kind of invisible. And it's not even clear that they had a single God. They may have lived very much in relation to the gods of other groups of people in the area. There's lots of ink spent on that. So, after the book tells about the creation, it then right away goes into the dominant, or one of the dominant concerns of the people at the time, namely that the people weren't all faithful to God's will. Well, God is invisible, and everybody on the earth is dealing with their bodies, feeding, warfare, protection, childbirth, and every kind of illness, every kind of struggle, and the God who is invisible so might be helping, but perhaps is not. In fact, it might be a fiction. So around the same time that the other traditions in the world, Confucianism, Taoism, Bhagavad Gita, Buddha, etc., start wondering about what we can know and whether our knowledge of the divine is reliable, then it's the Hebrews begin to say, maybe we don't really know this God. Maybe God's not listening, maybe God's not all that helpful, maybe God doesn't really like us very well, or maybe there's just, it really doesn't matter. And they go on with their lives in a way that some people that later come to be called prophets, say, you're not listening. When God led the Jewish people out of Egypt into the Holy Land, and he gave Moses the 10 Commandments, right? It was, you must have no other God before the God of Israel, and other very important commandments, the 10 of them, which most people memorize in school at some point. Now, all of this is within the framework of not only God revealing what God thinks or what God wants or what God rules, but also that God is guiding. God is actively guiding this people and so that they can be kind of a light unto the whole of humanity. And so then when the people don't do that, God sends punishment. So there's a section on Noah and his wife who build an ark, and they bring two animals two animals from within the area, and basically the rains come, and everyone on earth is destroyed except the people on Noah's ark. Well, that's not historically true. They were still in myth at this point. So when do we get into history or a real chronology that we can date with some reasonable accuracy? It's when God reveals to Abraham, who is in a section called Ur in Arabia, and it's a long way to the Holy Land, and God appears to Abraham and tells him to go to the Holy Land, and he will make Abraham the father of a nation. Sure enough, God guides Abraham. God also guides Isaac, his son, and he also guides Jacob. And these three become what is known as the patriarchs, the elderly male, authoritative, God-chosen, God-guided individuals who are responsible for the Jewish people. And so some people, with very good reason, complain that the Jewish tradition is patriarchal. That is to say, it doesn't focus on sort of the ordinary people or on a matristic line where men and women are equal. Each of these figures is male. Each of them is very powerful and has deep authority and a kind of a numinous quality that comes directly from having been chosen by God. Then after these three, there's also the Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob's 12 sons, and that leads to when they're dispersed, they lead to the 12 tribes of Israel. And the youngest, the youngest is Benjamin, the next to the youngest is Joseph, and Joseph is said that he has a coat of many colors, which I think means he has a great personality and many talents, and he's greatly blessed. And the envious sons throw him in a pit and leave him there to die. And some travelers, merchants, come and find him and bring him to Egypt. And Egypt then is one of the world's great powers, perhaps the preeminent power in the world, very highly evolved with pharaonic knowledge and pharaonic power and civility. And Joseph then distinguishes himself with an ability to interpret dreams. So you see how dreams are so respected. In prison, he interpreted a dream showing that the plump cows are going to be followed by lean cows, and Joseph gets word to the Pharaoh that this means you're going to have 7 good years of harvest, and then 7 years of famine. And quite incredibly, Pharaoh follows Joseph's interpretation of the dream. And Joseph then becomes very prominent, and then when there's the 7 years of harvest come, the brothers come to Egypt to get food and find Joseph, and then Joseph brings his father, who dies there in Goshen, and is brought back to Israel. So this is wonderful story. It's thrilling. It has a happy ending. It's God guided. There's lots of morals in it, and it's very typical of the Hebrew Scriptures, at least in these early books. All right. So in this course, we're going to study the book of Genesis, or at least most of it, including the long section about Joseph, which is quite dramatic and exciting, and with a happy ending, because it gets the Jewish people after a 200-year captivity in Egypt. They then are led out by Moses, and that becomes then a whole new chapter, the God guiding Moses and the Jewish people through the sea, a sea of reeds, and the Egyptians follow them, and the Egyptians with their heavy armor are buried in the waters, overwhelming them, and the Israelis escape and are given, and God sends the Ten Commandments to Moses and sends them out into this land that becomes theirs. So if you follow anything about Israeli-Palestinian politics, one of the things you probably have to say to figure out who's right, who's wrong, who's what to do, and whatever else is, how far back do you go? So the Palestinians were there when the Jews came, but the Jews, of course, argue, yes, but we were given this by God. Well, that could be true, but the Palestinians don't think it is. So it's this ancient text of revealed by God to human beings, after all, and so it may not be, even if God is somehow inspiring human beings, it doesn't mean that human beings heard it accurately, or recorded it accurately, or remembered it accurately, or all kinds of other stuff. So you see, there's plenty of room for argument, disagreement, and misunderstanding, and also for insight, for reverence, for awe, mystery, etc. It's tremendously powerful and complicated and inspiring. So you see that how different this is for Confucius and from Lao Tzu, who have almost no reference to history, except that Confucius says he's trying to recover the values of the previous dynasty, the Zhou dynasty. Lao Tzu says almost nothing about history, and the Dhammapada, the fundamental Buddhist text, says nothing about history, certainly no personal God revealing. Here, this is a total paradigm shift. We're talking about a text that is somehow revealed or inspired by God, such that it actually transmit from God to human beings how we should live, what we should do, and which group of people somehow is chosen to be the carriers of God's work among God's word among the nations. So that's quite a dramatic story. All right, and you can see how it's distinctively Western because it's historical, it's moral, it's got strong view of justice, it's got quite a few elements that you don't find everywhere, and you do find very, very dramatically in the Jewish tradition that carries over into the Christian and into the Muslim. So maybe that's enough for a start. Because the whole rest of the book has those characteristics: history, morality, suffering, the redemption of suffering, that God will prevail, and that the suffering people will be somehow led to the light, led to peace. So some of the texts are kind of hard to know exactly where the justice is. Say the book of Job, for example, he gets to see God, but in the meantime his wife is dead, and the sheep and lots of things have already been decimated. And of course, you can't think about Jewish tradition and history without thinking about the Holocaust, when it's huge, a horrific, unprecedented slaughter of the Jewish people, probably 6 million Jews horribly executed by a country that, even if they were not Christian in the moment, certainly had been Christian, and many of them were still Christian, and many of them were Lutherans and Catholics, and just cooperating in this slaughter of the Jewish people. And so then you have to say, God, where are you? And that's an understandable reaction, and it's a reaction that Jewish thinkers, I'm thinking now Martin Buber, are wrestling with. What is our relationship to God? What is God's relationship to us, such that we have survived, but it's been a really hard history. And history is at the core of the revelation. It's not just sort of, oh, well, this would be nice, that would be nice. No, it's God is saying, you should be carrying out my will as a people. I have chosen you, and this is the revelation. So, there's a lot at issue, a lot at stake, and we want to approach it with critical intellectual capacity, but also with reverence and humility, because it's not clear. I don't think it's clear exactly what we make of these things, and they need to be contemplated and carried in a way that is worthy of the complexity and the depth of the issues. So welcome to the beginning of the Jewish scriptures, and before we finish, we'll talk something about the Book of Wisdom and what that has to do with Sophia in that line, but that's later on, right? Now we need to get into the paradigmatic characteristics, which are history, revelation, suffering, redemption, and the waiting for a Messiah who is foretold and who may or may not have come, depending on whether you're Jewish or Christian. So there are many dividing lines and many opposing points of view, which we will take up and try to hold with reverence and humility. Thank you very much.